Why did my guidance counselor call CPS when I stayed home during my mom's funeral? The social worker showed up at our door 3 days after we buried my mother, clipboard in hand, and a practiced expression of concern that looked more like suspicion. My dad answered the door still wearing the same wrinkled dress shirt from the funeral service, his eyes hollowed out from 63 hours of not sleeping, and the woman introduced herself as Patricia Lowell from Child Protective Services. She said they'd received a report alleging educational neglect and potential abuse, that I'd missed 9 consecutive days of school without legitimate explanation, and that my father had been unresponsive to school communications regarding my welfare. Dad just stood there in the doorway, his hand still on the knob, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find words in a language he'd forgotten. I was sitting on the couch behind him, still in sweatpants and one of Mom's old college hoodies, that still smelled faintly like her lavender lotion, and I watched this stranger in our living room explaining that she needed to interview me privately to assess whether I was in a safe environment. The absolute insanity of the timing, of someone questioning whether I was safe while we were drowning in grief so fresh it felt like broken glass in my chest, made me laugh. A sharp, broken sound that made both adults turn to stare at me. Patricia Lowell wrote something on her clipboard, and I realized my inappropriate laughter had just become evidence of something. I'd been a junior at Riverside High School for 7 months when Mom died. Before that, I was a pretty normal kid with a pretty normal life. Decent grades, mostly B's with some A's in English and history. I played on the JV soccer team, hung out with the same group of friends since middle school, and spent most weekends either at practice or gaming with my best friend Owen. My parents were both high school teachers. Mom taught English at a different school across town, and Dad taught chemistry at Riverside, which meant I got both the advantage and embarrassment of having a parent in the building. They'd been married for 19 years, together since college, and were the kind of stable, boring, functional family that made other kids jealous. Mom was 43, healthy, active, ran 3 times a week and did yoga. There was no warning, no signs, no chance to prepare. She had a brain aneurysm on a Saturday morning in early March while Dad and I were at my soccer game. She'd stayed home because she had papers to grade and a headache she'd mentioned was worse than usual. When we got back at 11:30, we found her on the kitchen floor. The paramedics said she'd been dead for at least 2 hours. Just gone. Like someone had flipped a switch and deleted her from existence. The first week after Mom died was a blur of people and casseroles and funeral arrangements. I didn't go to school. Dad didn't go to work. We moved through the house like ghosts, trying to figure out how to exist in a space that suddenly felt wrong without her in it. The funeral was on Thursday, 8 days after she died, and it was exactly as horrible as you'd imagine. Over 200 people showed up because Mom had taught for 17 years and knew half the town. Students she'd had a decade ago came back to pay respects. Her book club, her running group, parents of kids she'd taught. The church was packed. I sat in the front pew between Dad and Mom's sister Aunt Julie, who'd flown in from Seattle, and I couldn't cry even though I wanted to. My body just felt hollow and numb and disconnected. People kept hugging me and saying things like, "She's in a better place, and at least she didn't suffer," and I wanted to scream that there was no better place than here with us, and that we were the ones suffering now. After the burial, people came back to our house for the reception. Aunt Julie had organized it with help from Mom's friends. The house filled with quiet conversations and sad smiles and more casseroles than we could possibly eat. My guidance counselor, Ms. Brennan, was there. She'd come to the funeral and the reception, had hugged me and told me to take all the time I needed, that school would be waiting when I was ready. I'd nodded and thanked her, assuming she meant it. I went back to school the following Monday, 9 days after Mom died and 4 days after the funeral. Dad had gone back to work that same day because, as he explained with exhausted pragmatism, sitting at home wasn't bringing her back and the distraction might help. I wasn't sure I agreed, but I also wasn't sure staying home alone was better than facing people at school. The morning started with awkward condolences from teachers and careful avoidance from most students who clearly didn't know what to say to someone whose mom had just died. My friends tried to act normal, which I appreciated, but even Owen seemed unsure how to talk to me. Third period was when I had to go to the guidance office for what I thought would be a quick check-in about makeup work and maybe some schedule adjustments to help me catch up. Ms. Brennan's office was in the administrative hallway, a small room with motivational posters and college brochures and 2 chairs facing her desk. She was maybe 45, had been at Riverside for 12 years, and had a reputation for being strict about attendance and deadlines. She greeted me with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes and gestured to the chair across from her desk. The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt somehow ominous. She started by asking how I was doing, a question so absurd given the circumstances that I almost laughed again. I said I was managing, trying to catch up on work, taking it day by day. All the things you're supposed to say when people ask questions they don't really want honest answers to. Ms. Brennan nodded and made a note on the pad in front of her. Then she said she needed to discuss my absences. I'd missed 9 consecutive school days, which exceeded the district's policy for excused absences, even in cases of family emergency. She said she understood these were extraordinary circumstances, but the school still needed proper documentation and a plan for making up missed work. I told her I'd brought a copy of the death certificate and the funeral program, which seemed like sufficient documentation that my mother had died and I'd been attending her funeral. Ms. Brennan examined both documents with an expression I couldn't read, then set them aside and said we needed to discuss my emotional state and whether I was receiving appropriate support at home. The shift in topic caught me off guard. I said I was seeing a therapist starting next week, that Dad and I were figuring things out, that Aunt Julie had stayed for a few extra days to help. Ms. Brennan made more notes, her pen scratching across the paper in a way that made my stomach tighten. She asked if my father was coping well with the loss, if he was providing adequate supervision and emotional support, if there were any concerns about his ability to care for me during this difficult time. The questions felt wrong, too probing, too suspicious. I told her Dad was grieving but managing, that we were supporting each other, that we had family and friends helping. Ms. Brennan's expression remained neutral as she asked whether my father had been home during the days I'd missed school, whether he'd been supervising me or if I'd been alone, whether anyone had checked on me regularly. I felt my face getting hot as I realized she was implying something darker than grief. I said Dad had been home most of the time, that we'd been together planning the funeral and dealing with the aftermath, that we'd had constant visitors and support. She wrote more notes, then looked up at me with that practiced, concerned expression. She said she needed to be frank with me. 9 consecutive absences without a parent contacting the school to excuse them was a red flag for educational neglect. My father, despite being a teacher in the district, hadn't submitted any formal absence excuse forms or communicated with the attendance office. She'd called our home number multiple times and left messages that went unreturned. From the school's perspective, I'd simply vanished for over a week without explanation, and now I'd returned claiming a family emergency, but showing signs of possible trauma or instability. The laugh I'd let out when she'd mentioned documentation, my disheveled appearance, my inability to make eye contact. All of these were concerning indicators that required further investigation. I sat there trying to process what she was saying. My mother had died. We'd buried her 4 days ago, and this woman was sitting across from me suggesting that my grief and Dad's grief were evidence of neglect and instability. I pointed out that she'd been at the funeral. She'd seen the death certificate. She knew exactly why I'd been absent. Ms. Brennan nodded slowly and said that yes, she'd attended the funeral out of respect for our family and her professional relationship with my father as a colleague. But her personal attendance didn't change the school's policies regarding attendance documentation and parental communication. She said the school had protocols that applied to all families regardless of circumstances, and those protocols existed to protect students. She asked again whether I felt safe at home, whether there was anything I wanted to tell her about my father's behavior or mental state, whether I needed help. The implication was so clear and so insulting that I stood up without meaning to. I told her my mom had just died. My dad was devastated but doing his best. We'd been buried in funeral arrangements and grief and apparently hadn't filled out the right forms fast enough for her satisfaction. I said if she had concerns, she should talk to my dad directly instead of interrogating me. Ms. Brennan's expression hardened. She said my defensive attitude was noted and that she had a duty to report any situation where a student's welfare might be at risk. I asked what that meant, and she said she'd be documenting this conversation and consulting with administration about next steps. I left her office shaking with anger and confusion. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I couldn't focus in classes, couldn't eat lunch, couldn't stop replaying the conversation and trying to figure out what I'd said wrong or how it had gone so sideways. When I got home, Dad was in the kitchen attempting to make dinner from one of the casseroles someone had brought. He looked exhausted but was trying, and seeing him struggle with basic tasks that Mom had always handled made my chest ache. I told him about the meeting with Ms. Brennan, about her questions and accusations and threats. Dad's face went through several expressions: confusion, anger, disbelief. He said he'd call the school tomorrow and straighten everything out, that obviously there'd been a miscommunication, that once administration understood what had happened, they'd drop whatever concerns Ms. Brennan had raised. He said she was probably just following protocol, doing her job, and we shouldn't take it personally. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe this was just bureaucratic nonsense that would resolve itself. But something about the way Ms. Brennan had looked at me, the careful way she'd phrased her questions, made me think this wasn't going to be simple. Dad called Riverside High the next morning before school started. I was in my room getting ready when I heard his voice rising in the kitchen, frustration bleeding through his usual calm. When I came downstairs, he was pacing with his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand running through his hair repeatedly. I heard him say, "My wife just died, and, of course I didn't call the attendance office, and this is absolutely ridiculous." When he hung up, his face was flushed and his jaw was clenched. He told me he'd spoken with the principal, Dr. Kimberly Thorne, who'd been sympathetic, but also said that Ms. Brennan had already filed a report with the district about her concerns regarding my welfare and his capacity as a guardian. The report had been submitted the same day as our conversation, immediately after I'd left her office. Dr. Thorne had suggested Dad provide documentation of Mom's death and proof of our family situation to help clear up any misunderstandings. She'd also recommended we cooperate fully with any follow-up inquiries to demonstrate there was nothing to worry about. Dad was furious. He said he'd worked at Riverside for 16 years, that everyone knew him and knew our family, That the idea he'd need to prove he was a fit parent while grieving his wife was insulting beyond measure. He called his union representative and left a message. He emailed Dr. Thorne copies of the death certificate, funeral program, and a letter from our family doctor confirming we were both receiving grief counseling. He did everything right, followed every protocol, provided every document requested. It wasn't enough. The knock on our door came 3 days later, Saturday afternoon, when we were both home trying to figure out how to sort through Mom's clothes. That's when Patricia Lowell from Child Protective Services arrived with her clipboard and her questions and her legal authority to investigate whether I was being neglected or abused. She explained that the school had filed a report expressing concerns about educational neglect, lack of parental supervision, and potential mental health crisis in the household following a traumatic death. She said CPS was required to investigate all reports involving minors, regardless of the source or apparent legitimacy. She needed to see the house, interview both of us separately, and assess the living situation. Dad tried to maintain composure, but I could see the rage building behind his eyes. He asked if she was seriously suggesting that grieving his wife and supporting his son through the worst experience of their lives constituted neglect. Patricia said she wasn't suggesting anything yet. She was gathering information. She asked to see my room. Dad showed her, and I watched her examine my space with clinical detachment. She noted the unmade bed, the pile of laundry in the corner, the dishes I'd left on my desk. She wrote things down. She asked to see the kitchen and made notes about the stack of unwashed dishes in the sink and the casseroles crowding the refrigerator. She checked the bathroom and wrote more observations. Every normal sign of a household in crisis became evidence of something suspicious in her documentation. The private interview happened in the living room with Dad sent to the kitchen. Patricia sat across from me and went through a series of questions delivered in a tone that was supposed to sound caring, but felt like an interrogation. How was I sleeping? Was I eating regularly? Did I feel safe in the house? Had my father's behavior changed since my mother's death? Had he been drinking excessively or showing signs of depression? Was I attending school regularly now? Did I have access to mental health support? Each question felt like a trap, and I tried to answer honestly while also defending my dad from implications I could hear underneath her words. I said we were both struggling with grief, but managing. That Dad was doing his best in an impossible situation. That yes, the house was messy, and we weren't eating great, but we'd just lost the person who'd held everything together, and we were trying to figure out how to function without her. Patricia wrote everything down, her expression never changing. When we were done, she interviewed Dad privately while I waited upstairs. I could hear their voices through the floor. Dad's rising in frustration several times, Patricia's remaining maddeningly calm and measured. After 90 minutes, she packed up her clipboard and told us she'd be filing her initial assessment report, and we should expect follow-up contact within the next week. She didn't say whether her assessment was positive or negative, whether we'd passed or failed some invisible test. She just left, and we stood in our living room feeling violated and angry and scared. Dad called a lawyer that same evening. He'd gotten a referral from another teacher whose family had dealt with a false CPS report years earlier. The lawyer was named Graham Whitfield, had practiced family law for 23 years, and charged $250 an hour. Dad explained everything over the phone, his voice tight with exhaustion and stress. Graham listened, asked clarifying questions, and then said something that made Dad's face go gray. He said that once CPS opened an investigation, they had broad authority to continue gathering information and interviewing people until they were satisfied there was no risk to the child. The investigation could take weeks or months. They could interview my teachers, my friends, my relatives. They could request medical records and school records. They could show up unannounced for home visits. And if they determined there was ongoing risk, they could petition for temporary removal pending further assessment. Dad asked what evidence they'd need to justify removal, and Graham said that unfortunately, the standard was lower than most people realized. Evidence of neglect could be as simple as consistent documentation of an unsafe living environment or parental incapacity. Things like a messy house, irregular meals, emotional distress in the child, things that looked a lot like what we were going through. Graham said we needed to be proactive, clean the house thoroughly, establish regular routines, document everything, get letters from my therapist, our family doctor, Dad's employer, character witnesses, build a paper trail showing we were stable and functional despite our grief. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare of performance and documentation. We cleaned the house like we were preparing for a magazine photo shoot. Dad cooked actual meals instead of reheating casseroles, and we ate together at the table instead of in front of the TV. He made sure I was up and dressed for school every day, drove me there himself, and checked in with my teachers about my progress. I forced myself to focus in classes, to turn in assignments, to act normal even when normal felt impossible. My therapist, Dr. Ellen Kowalski, who specialized in grief counseling and had 20 years of experience, wrote a letter stating that both Dad and I were processing our loss in healthy ways and posed no risk to each other. Our family doctor, Dr. Raymond Cho, provided documentation of our physical health and mental competency. Dad's principal, Dr. Thorne, wrote a letter saying he was a valued employee showing remarkable strength during personal tragedy. We assembled a folder of evidence proving we were fine, that we were coping, that there was no neglect or abuse. but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, judged, evaluated on our grief performance. Every morning when I walked into school, I wondered if Ms. Brennan was taking notes on my appearance or behavior. Every interaction felt like a test I might be failing. Ms. Brennan started calling me to her office weekly for what she termed wellness check-ins. These weren't optional meetings. I'd get pulled from class and sent to guidance, where she'd ask the same rotating set of questions about my home life, my father's state of mind, whether anything had changed or concerned me. I'd give the same careful answers, trying to be honest without giving her ammunition. She'd write in her notebook and remind me that her door was always open if I needed help. The implication was, always there, hanging in the air between us. She thought something was wrong. She was waiting for me to confirm it, or for evidence to emerge that would prove her suspicions. After the third meeting, I asked her directly why she kept calling me in. She said students who'd experienced trauma required additional monitoring to ensure they were receiving adequate support. I asked if she monitored all students who'd lost parents or just me. She said every case was different, and my situation had specific concerns that warranted closer attention. I asked what concerns, specifically, beyond the fact that my mom had died and we were grieving. Ms. Brennan's smile went thin and cold. She said my defensive attitude was itself concerning, and that students who were truly fine didn't typically respond to support offers with hostility. The conversation was a trap. No matter what I said, she found a way to make it evidence of problems. Patricia Lowell made 2 more home visits during those weeks. She'd show up unannounced, walk through the house, ask more questions. Each visit felt like an invasion. The third time she came, she brought another social worker with her, a younger man named Derek Foster, who she introduced as assisting with the case assessment. They interviewed me separately again, asking some of the same questions Patricia had asked before and some new ones. Derek asked about my relationship with my father before my mother's death, whether we'd been close or distant, whether there'd been conflicts or tension in the family. I said we'd been normal, fine, close enough. Derek made notes and asked whether my mother's death had changed the dynamics between my father and me, whether I felt he blamed me for anything or projected his grief onto me. The question was so bizarre I actually laughed, which again became something they wrote down. I said no, my dad didn't blame me for mom dying because that would be insane. Derek said sometimes people experienced complicated grief reactions that manifested in unexpected ways. I told him my dad was sad, not crazy. Patricia asked if my father had discussed any financial concerns with me, whether I was aware of any struggles paying bills or managing expenses. I said we hadn't talked about money much, but I assumed we were okay, since both my parents had been teachers with decent salaries and benefits. She made more notes. The investigation expanded to include interviews at school. Patricia showed up one afternoon and met with my teachers, asking about my classroom behavior and academic performance. She talked to Owen and some of my other friends, asking about my home life and whether I'd said anything concerning. She interviewed the school nurse about whether I'd come in with any injuries or complaints. She even talked to my soccer coach about whether I'd shown up to practices and how I'd been performing. Each conversation became another data point in her assessment, another piece of evidence she was building, into some narrative about my life. My friends told me afterward that the questions had felt weird and invasive, that Patricia had seemed determined to find problems, even when they insisted I was fine. Owen said she'd asked specifically whether my father drank heavily or showed signs of depression. Another friend, Caleb, said she'd asked if I ever came to school hungry or in dirty clothes. They were painting a picture of neglect that didn't exist, gathering fragments of normal teenage life and recontextualizing them as evidence of a household in crisis. The investigation had taken on its own momentum, becoming self-sustaining regardless of actual facts. I started having panic attacks. Real ones, not the vague anxiety I'd felt before. They'd hit at random times, in class or at home or lying in bed at night. My chest would tighten, my breathing would get shallow and fast, and I'd feel like I was drowning. Dr. Kowalski said it was a trauma response, that the combination of losing my mother and being investigated by CPS had created overwhelming stress my body couldn't process normally. She gave me breathing exercises and coping strategies and increased our sessions to twice weekly. But knowing the panic attacks were normal responses to abnormal circumstances didn't make them less terrifying when they happened. And worse, I knew that if anyone at school saw me having a panic attack, it would become more evidence for Ms. Brennan's case that I was unstable and needed intervention. The system designed to help was actively making everything worse, and there was no way to opt out or make it stop. We were trapped in a nightmare of bureaucratic process that treated our grief as suspicious and our struggling as proof of inadequacy. Dad started looking older. His hair seemed grayer, the lines around his eyes deeper. He'd lost weight because he kept making food for me, but forgetting to eat himself. At night, I'd hear him crying in his bedroom, raw, broken sounds that made my own chest ache. But during the day, he maintained the performance. He went to work, taught his classes, graded papers. He came home and made dinner and asked about my day. He cleaned the house and paid the bills and attended parent meetings. He was doing everything right by every objective measure, and it still wasn't enough to make the investigation end. The crisis peaked 6 weeks after Patricia's first visit. She showed up unannounced on a Wednesday evening with Derek and a police officer. Dad answered the door, and I saw his face go white. Patricia said they'd received an additional report from the school raising new concerns, and they needed to conduct a more thorough assessment of the home environment and our well-being. The police officer, a middle-aged woman named Sergeant Linda Hayes with 15 years on the force, was there as a precaution to ensure everyone's safety during the visit. Dad asked what new concerns, what additional report. Patricia said Ms. Brennan had documented several incidents over the past month where I'd appeared distressed at school, had missed multiple counseling appointments with her office, and had been observed having what appeared to be an emotional breakdown in the hallway between classes. None of this was accurate. I'd been to every required meeting with Ms. Brennan. The one time I'd gotten upset at school was when a teacher had mentioned something that reminded me of Mom, and I'd needed to step out of class for a few minutes to compose myself. But in Patricia's version, filtered through Ms. Brennan's documentation, it became evidence of escalating crisis and parental failure to provide adequate mental health support. They wanted to talk to me alone again. Dad refused. He said we'd cooperated fully with every request, provided every document, answered every question. Now they were showing up with police presence based on fabricated reports from a guidance counselor who'd decided we were suspicious for grieving our wife and mother. He said if they wanted to continue this investigation, they could go through our attorney. Patricia's expression hardened, and she said that refusal to cooperate with CPS could be documented as obstruction and could result in emergency protective custody. The threat was clear. Let them interrogate me again, or they'd take me away. Dad called Graham Whitfield right there on the spot, put him on speaker. Graham told Patricia and Derek that they were welcome to schedule a formal interview with appropriate notice and legal representation present, but showing up unannounced with police to coerce cooperation crossed legal boundaries. He said if they had evidence of immediate danger requiring emergency custody, they should present it. Otherwise, they needed to leave and follow proper procedure. Patricia said the investigation was ongoing and they had authority to assess the situation. Graham said the assessment had been ongoing for 6 weeks without any findings of actual neglect or abuse, and what they were doing now looked a lot like harassment of a grieving family. He said he'd be filing a complaint with CPS administration and potentially a lawsuit if they continued this pattern. Patricia and Derek exchanged looks. After a tense minute, Patricia said they'd be scheduling a formal interview and we'd receive notice. They left, but the police presence and the threat had made everything crystal clear. This wasn't going to end on its own. They were building a case, and unless we fought back aggressively, they'd eventually find some technicality or interpretation that justified taking action against us. Dad and I sat in the living room after they left, both shaking with adrenaline and fear. He said we needed to go on offense, stop just defending ourselves, and start exposing what was really happening. Graham filed a formal complaint with CPS the next morning, alleging harassment and investigation bias. He documented the timeline of the case, the lack of any substantive evidence of neglect, the escalating intrusions based on subjective reports from a school counselor with apparent personal agenda. He demanded that CPS either present concrete findings or close the investigation. He also filed a complaint with the school district about Ms. Brennan's conduct, alleging that she'd weaponized her position to target our family during our most vulnerable time. The district's response was bureaucratic and non-committal. They said all guidance counselors were mandatory reporters required to document any concerns about student welfare, and Ms. Brennan had followed appropriate protocol. Graham pushed back, arguing that filing a CPS report 3 days after a student's mother died based on normal grief responses wasn't appropriate protocol. It was cruelty. He requested access to all of Ms. Brennan's documentation regarding me, citing my dad's rights as a parent to review records affecting my welfare. The district initially refused, claiming counselor notes were confidential. Graham threatened a lawsuit under education privacy laws. They eventually provided a heavily redacted version of Ms. Brennan's file on me. What we could read was damning. She'd been documenting concerns since before Mom even died. The file included notes from months earlier, observations that I'd seemed withdrawn or distracted in classes, that my grades had dipped slightly in the fall semester, that I'd been late to school several times. All normal teenage behavior, but Ms. Brennan had been tracking it as evidence of problems at home. After Mom's death, her notes became more pointed. She'd documented my appearance each time she saw me in the hallway or cafeteria, hair messy, clothes wrinkled, eyes red from crying. She'd noted times I'd left class early or arrived late, casting each instance as concerning rather than understanding it as grief. She'd written that my father's failure to immediately contact the school about my absences suggested incapacity or impairment. She'd recorded her suspicion that our household lacked structure and supervision. Her bias wasn't subtle. She'd decided we were a problem before gathering evidence, then interpreted everything through that lens. Graham said this was textbook confirmation bias and potentially actionable misconduct. He drafted a formal complaint to the State Board of Education and the School Counseling Licensing Board, attaching Ms. Brennan's notes as evidence of unprofessional conduct and abuse of mandatory reporter status. But complaints took time to investigate, and in the meantime, the CPS case remained open and active. The formal interview happened 2 weeks later at CPS offices downtown. Graham represented us, and a CPS supervisor named Carolyn Finch joined Patricia and Derek. The conference room was institutional and depressing, with fluorescent lights and a table scratched from years of difficult conversations. Carolyn opened by saying they'd reviewed the case file and had questions about some of the documentation and allegations. Graham presented our evidence systematically. Letters from Dr. Kowalski detailing our grief counseling progress. Documentation from Dr. Cho about our physical and mental health. Statements from family friends and Dad's colleagues attesting to our stable home life. School records showing my attendance had improved and I was keeping up with coursework. Photos of our clean, organized home. Everything demonstrating we were functioning despite tragedy. Patricia countered with Ms. Brennan's reports, emphasizing my emotional distress, the initial 9-day absence, and her observations of concerning behavior. Graham asked directly why normal grief responses were being characterized as evidence of neglect, why a family dealing with sudden traumatic loss was being investigated for struggling instead of supported. Carolyn said CPS had to investigate all reports thoroughly to ensure child safety. Graham asked what specific evidence of actual neglect or abuse they'd found in 6 weeks of investigation. Carolyn admitted they hadn't found direct evidence, but maintained that the situation required monitoring given the initial concerns. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Owen's mother, Lisa Brennan, was an attorney who specialized in education law. Owen had told her about the investigation and what Ms. Brennan had done, and Lisa had started digging into the guidance counselor's history. She discovered that Ms. Brennan had filed CPS reports against 3 other families in the past 4 years. All 3 cases had been closed without findings. All 3 involved single parents or households that had experienced major trauma. The pattern suggested that Ms. Brennan had a history of over-reporting and viewing family crisis as inherently suspicious. Lisa shared this information with Graham, who immediately requested those case files under Freedom of Information laws. 2 of the 3 families agreed to speak with us about their experiences. Their stories were eerily similar to ours. Ms. Brennan had identified some trigger event, framed normal stress responses as concerning, filed reports that initiated investigations that found nothing. One family had dealt with CPS involvement for 8 months before being cleared. The other had been investigated for 4 months. Both families described the process as re-traumatizing and said Ms. Brennan had never apologized or acknowledged any overreach. This was her pattern. She saw crisis and assumed the worst, then used her authority as a mandatory reporter to trigger investigations that validated her suspicions through their very existence. Graham compiled everything into a comprehensive brief, documenting Ms. Brennan's pattern of inappropriate reporting and CPS's failure to recognize they were being used as a tool of harassment rather than protection. He submitted it to Carolyn Finch and demanded the investigation be closed immediately. He also sent copies to the school district superintendent, the school board, and a reporter at the local newspaper named Jennifer Kovacs, who'd written about CPS reform issues. Jennifer was interested. She interviewed our family, the other families Ms. Brennan had reported, and education experts about mandatory reporter responsibilities and the potential for abuse. Her article ran 3 weeks later with the headline, "When Mandatory Reporting Becomes Harassment, How One School Counselor's Overcorrection Traumatized Grieving Families." The article detailed our case and the others, quoted experts saying that mandatory reporters needed training to distinguish between signs of abuse and normal crisis responses, and raised questions about oversight of CPS investigations initiated by serial reporters. The public response was immediate and intense. The article went viral on local social media. Parents flooded the school board meeting demanding accountability. The state counseling board announced they'd be investigating Ms. Brennan's licensure. CPS headquarters issued a statement saying they'd be reviewing internal protocols for screening reports from sources with history of unsubstantiated referrals. The investigation into our family was closed 3 days after the article published. Carolyn Finch sent a formal letter stating that CPS had determined there was no evidence of neglect or abuse, and the case was being closed with no findings. The letter didn't apologize for the months of intrusion and stress. It just stated the bureaucratic conclusion and moved on. Ms. Brennan was placed on administrative leave pending the district's investigation into her conduct. The school board held a public hearing where Dad and the other affected families testified about the harm caused by her inappropriate reports. Ms. Brennan attended with her union representative but didn't speak. Her expression throughout the testimony was defensive and resentful. No acknowledgement that she'd done anything wrong. The board's investigation took 6 weeks and concluded that while Ms. Brennan had acted within her authority as a mandatory reporter, she'd shown poor judgment in interpreting normal grief and crisis responses as evidence of neglect. She was required to complete additional training on trauma-informed practice and would be subject to enhanced supervision of her reporting decisions. She wasn't fired, wasn't even formally disciplined beyond the retraining requirement. The system protected her while we'd been left to fend for ourselves. The state counseling board's investigation took longer but had more teeth. They reviewed all of Ms. Brennan's CPS reports and her case documentation and found a pattern of poor professional judgment and failure to consider alternative explanations for student behavior before making serious allegations. They suspended her license for 18 months and required completion of ethics training and supervised practice before reinstatement. The school district decided not to renew her contract after the suspension period ended. She'd effectively lost her career, though not through direct firing. The informal network of education professionals would ensure she'd have difficulty getting hired elsewhere once her history became known. It wasn't the dramatic public reckoning I'd fantasized about, but it was consequence. She'd harmed families through misuse of her authority and now faced professional and financial consequences for that harm. Dad and I filed a civil lawsuit against the school district for emotional distress and violation of our rights. Graham said we had a strong case given the documented pattern of misconduct and the district's inadequate oversight. The district's insurance company pushed for settlement rather than trial. After months of negotiation, we accepted a settlement of $85,000. The money meant less than the acknowledgement that what had happened to us was wrong and actionable. We used part of it to pay Graham's legal fees and donated the rest to an organization that provided free legal support to families dealing with CPS investigations. Felt right to turn our suffering into something that might help others. A year later, I'm a senior preparing for college. Mom's been gone for 15 months, and the grief is different now. Less sharp, more like a constant ache that I've learned to live with. Dad and I are closer than we were before. Trauma either breaks families or bonds them, and we chose bonding. He's dating again, which felt weird at first, but I'm glad he's not staying frozen in grief. I got accepted to 3 universities and am planning to study social work. Want to work in systems that are supposed to help people and try to make them actually helpful instead of harmful? Ms. Brennan's name still makes me angry when I hear it, but mostly I feel sorry for her. She'd apparently been so convinced that her role was catching hidden abuse that she'd stopped being able to see families in crisis as anything but suspicious. Her need to be the hero who saved endangered children had made her into someone who endangered children who needed support instead. The system that empowered her never trained her properly, never supervised her adequately, never caught the pattern until families like mine had already been harmed. That's the real villain in all this. Not one misguided counselor, but the entire structure that allowed someone like her to weaponize concern and transform grief into evidence of guilt. They say loss teaches you who people really are, and they're right. Mom's death showed me that some people see tragedy and rush to help, while others see tragedy and assume guilt. Ms. Brennan was the second type. She looked at a family drowning in grief and decided we were suspicious for not drowning more gracefully. But we survived her investigation the same way we survived losing Mom. By supporting each other, by fighting for truth, and by refusing to let cruelty be the final word. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.